Hey guys, tonight we're heading back to a time when a muddy little Dutch trading post called New Amsterdam sat quietly at the southern tip of an island you now know as Manhattan. Picture this. Wooden fences barely holding back the wild, narrow dirt paths squishing under wooden clogs, and grumpy colonists trying to run a city where half the population is more concerned about beaver pelts than governance. It smells like smoke, fish, and maybe a little too much ambition. You're not here as a grand explorer or noble diplomat. You're someone's assistant, probably unpaid, and you've been sent down to the docks to count barrels. Again, there's a wind off the harbor, the kind that finds its way into your sleeves and stays there all day. Seagulls squawk overhead. You swat one away with your ledger. This is not the New York you know. This is a world where fur is currency. Taxes are paid in salted eels, and your neighbor might be a Swedish blacksmith with 3 goats and a personal grudge against the Dutch governor. You probably won't survive this place if you're allergic to mud or to poorly fermented beer. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Drop your location and local time in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The year is somewhere around 1650, and you're squinting across the East River. The skyline is, well, it's mostly trees, maybe a few sheep. You've heard rumors of a place far across the sea where people are fighting over islands so small they barely show up on maps. You chuckle. Who'd fight over some speck of jungle when there's good honest swamp right here? Still, the Dutch West India Company says you're part of something bigger. You're helping anchor their claim to the New World. This bustling little outpost with its stockade walls and its curiously multilingual population. There are Dutch, English, French, Swedes, Africans, and indigenous peoples moving through the same muddy lanes, trading, arguing, occasionally marrying, and trying not to get caught stealing goats. Mainstream historical fact? New Amsterdam really was that diverse. By 1660, records showed at least 18 languages being spoken in this little colonial mishmash. It was a port town, after all, and ports tend to gather stories and people from every direction. Quirky tidbit? The colony's first recorded crime was a drunken pig fight. Or rather, someone got drunk, released a bunch of pigs into a neighbor's yard, and then the pigs trampled a cabbage patch. It escalated from there. You imagine colonial police trying to arrest a pig. That's probably why they needed a wall. Yes, that wall. Wall Street today was quite literally a wall to keep livestock, and occasionally the English out. The governor, Peter Stuyvesant, is not amused by pigs or the English. He has a wooden leg and a very low tolerance for nonsense. You once saw him yell at a baker for undersalting pretzels. He runs a colony like a moody uncle, half terrifying, half weirdly particular about cleaning fish on Thursdays. Historians still argue whether New Amsterdam ever really functioned as a model Dutch colony, or it was always just a chaotic frontier post wrapped in tulip-themed optimism. You think it might be a little of both. There's trade, there's commerce, and there's an awful lot of yelling in Dutch. Your job, if it can be called that, involves ferrying messages between company agents and trying to remember who gets which sack of beaver pelts. You've begun to dream of beavers. They look at you in your sleep with tiny accusing eyes. The fur trade is booming, and every time a trapper comes in from the north, there's this ripple through town like, he's got furs. Maybe he'll trade for a copper kettle, or beer, or that chair someone stole from the church. This was the lifeblood of Dutch America. Not gold, not land, fur. Soft, dense, waterproof fur that made the finest hats in Europe. Gentlemen back in Amsterdam would pay obscene amounts for beaver hats they'd never wear twice. You're lucky if your shoes match. New Amsterdam isn't glamorous, but it's important. It's the foothold. The Dutch are carving a corner of the New World for themselves, and they're doing it with tidy ledgers, questionable maps, and a strong belief that if they just keep trading, everything will work out. And to be fair, it kind of does for a while. You walk back from the docks, passing that one tavern with the leaning chimney, and the parrot that swears in Portuguese. Someone's playing a hurdy-gurdy. Children chase geese down the main path. There's a merchant shouting, about salted herring. You breathe it all in, the earthy, spicy, slightly fishy smell of early New York. And you don't know it yet, but across the ocean, people are arguing in candlelit rooms about whether your entire muddy little town is worth giving away. You can't even get your boots clean, and somewhere in London they're saying, well, what if we just swap it? But you'll get there. For now. You close the door to your drafty little room, shake the dust from your tunic, and try not to think about the beaver that bit your cousin last week. You've got a full day tomorrow, 3 crates of nutmeg to inventory, and only 1 candle left. You settle in, and as the wind whistles through the gaps in the wall, you wonder, what kind of island is worth more than all this? You wake up with your cheek stuck to a sheaf of shipping manifests and a mild fear that you've once again forgotten to submit last week's beaver tallies. But today, oddly enough, you're not at the docks. Today, you're standing on the deck of a Dutch trading ship, sails stretched tight above you, ropes creaking like sleepy old bones. Ahead lies the Banda Sea, turquoise, endless, and humming with heat, and you're squinting at a small, forested speck on the horizon that, you're told, is the island of Run. You cup a hand over your eyes. It looks disappointing. Honestly, it resembles a mislaid lump of jungle someone forgot to clean up. It's green, steep, and mostly uninhabited, except for a few bold trees hanging onto the cliffs like they know something you don't. And yet, this tiny scrap of land, barely 2 miles long, is arguably the most valuable real estate in the 17th century world. More valuable than your muddy New Amsterdam. More valuable than all of England's tobacco fields. Why? Because the speck grows nutmeg. Real nutmeg. The kind that makes European nobles swoon, apothecaries fill their ledgers, and entire fleets risk typhoid just to get a taste. You lean on the rail, watching as the ship slowly approaches the shore. The heat is syrupy. The air smells like salt and spice, and something just a bit like moldy cinnamon. Mainstream historical fact? The island of Run is one of the Banda Islands, part of modern-day Indonesia. In the 1600s, it was the only place in the world where nutmeg trees grew natively. And nutmeg wasn't just a seasoning. It was believed to cure a plague, settle the stomach, and ensure eternal youth, depending on who you asked. It also flavored pies, which may have been the most important part. Your feet hit the sand, and it feels like stepping into a dream. Dense groves of nutmeg trees curve overhead, their trunks mottled and twisting. The fruit dangles like golden pears, each holding a precious seed wrapped in red lace. That's mace, another highly prized spice. You pick one up. It's light, fragrant. You barely notice it unless you knew what it was worth. And here's the kicker. Europe has no idea how to grow this stuff anywhere else. People have tried planting nutmeg trees in India, in Africa, even in greenhouses. The trees die, or the spice turns out weak, or the seeds just rot. The Banda Islands, especially Run, are the gold mine. Except instead of gold, it's fruit. Spicy, wrinkly, high-maintenance fruit. Quirky tidbit? The locals on Run didn't think nutmeg was particularly magical. They use it for cooking, yes, but they were baffled by the European obsession. One English merchant noted that the islanders eat it not, nor hoard it, nor think on it twice. That's kind of like someone showing up at your house, offering a fleet of ships in exchange for your spice rack. Historians still argue whether Run was truly as world-changing as it's made out to be, or whether its fame is inflated by the sheer absurdity of what came next. Because what happens on Run echoes all the way to Manhattan. You wander through the groves with a Dutch factor, a company agent in a crumpled hat and sweat-streaked collar. He talks fast. Something about annual yield, sack weights, and export quotas. You nod politely, still thinking about the tree you just touched. It's older than you. Probably older than Peter Stuyvesant's temper. The company built a few huts here, a palisade, and of course, a trading post. But the island is fiercely contested. The English, ever persistent, also claim it. They've even struck informal deals with local chieftains to secure a patch of land for themselves. The Dutch aren't thrilled about this. The whole thing is about to turn into a very slow, very tropical standoff. Why not just share the island? You ask, foolishly. The Dutchman turns to you, sweat in his beard. Because that tree, he points at a nutmeg grove, is worth more than all your beaver pelts. You blink. He's not exaggerating. In Europe, a pound of nutmeg could sell for more than a laborer made in a month. A single sack might buy you a small house. Spices weren't just flavor. They were status medicine miracle. They came wrapped in myth, moved through secret routes, and were hoarded like dragon gold. You pass a plantation where enslaved laborers work under brutal heat. This isn't the part they put on the posters. The Dutch East India Company, VOC, if you're feeling official, runs these islands like a business, but one with cannons. They enforce spice monopolies ruthlessly. Ships are searched. Groves are burned if unauthorized. Smuggling nutmeg is, quite literally, a capital offense. You wonder if anyone back in New Amsterdam would believe this place. Maybe the tavern parrot would. He's seen some things. And yet, Run doesn't look like a battlefield. It looks like paradise. The hills are velvety green. The sea glitters like scattered glass, and the nutmeg trees sway lazily in the breeze. You could almost forget that nations are poised to draw blood over this little clump of earth. Almost. You head back to the docks, passing a stack of crates already marked with VOC seals. Somewhere across the sea, people are already preparing their ledgers. Somewhere in a Dutch boardroom, men with starched collars are debating if this island is worth trading something else for, something like a minor outpost in the Americas. But you don't know that yet. All you know is that you're very sweaty, the air smells amazing, and you are 80% sure you just saw someone bribe a goat with mace. You step back onto the ship, eyes lingering on Run. It's tiny, it's remote, and it's about to become the center of the strangest real estate deal in world history. You've barely dried the tropical sweat from your socks before someone hands you a ledger and starts talking nutmeg pricing. Again, because now that you've seen Run, felt its heat, smelled its trees, swatted away its truly aggressive mosquitoes, it's time to understand why this spice sent nation scrambling over oceans with contracts in one hand and cannons in the other. Nutmeg fever. They called it. Not officially, of course, but that's what it felt like. From the late 1500s into the 1600s, nutmeg was a spice, rich, warm, pungent, and absurdly exclusive. You couldn't just toss it into your apple pie back then like you do now. No, back then it was a miracle wrapped in a seed. Let's set the scene. You're in a chilly European apothecary, shelves lined with herbs, powders, and jars containing substances no one should ever put in tea. Nutmeg sits in a place of honor, crushed, distilled, shaved into tinctures. It's a cure for plague, melancholy, indigestion, and maybe heartbreak if you're desperate. Historians still argue whether anyone genuinely believed nutmeg could prevent the Black Death, or if it was just a luxurious placebo you could wave under your nose while your neighbor coughed ominously. But the belief was there, and belief sells. You leave the apothecary and step into a manor house. A noble woman adds nutmeg to her wine, then dabs a bit behind her ears, because yes, it was used as perfume too. A court chef grates it over roast meats like he's dusting them with magic. People at court debate whether too much nutmeg causes visions or just very expensive burps. Meanwhile, the merchant who brought it in quietly triples his asking price. Mainstream historical fact? At one point in the early 1600s, a pound of nutmeg in London could cost as much as 7 fattened oxen. That's not spice. That's economic sorcery. Quirky tidbit? One fashion-forward Londoner was rumored to carry a solid silver nutmeg grater on his belt, just in case his dinner needed a boost. Imagine that, a pocket grater. You try not to think about how often it probably poked him while sitting. And where did all this magic come from? Run, and her sisters, the other Banda Islands, but mostly Run. And that meant whoever controlled Run controlled the spice. You glance at a map, a real one, with sea monsters and mislabeled continents. The Banda Islands are tiny, way out near what we now call Indonesia. But on this map, they're drawn with almost reverent care. Shading, arrows, annotations about wind patterns. Someone has circled Run in red ink and scrawled essential next to it. You wonder if they use nutmeg-scented ink. The Dutch want it all, of course. That's where the fever comes in. Not just individual longing, but institutional obsession. The Dutch East India Company doesn't just want to trade nutmeg. They want to own nutmeg. Lock, stock, and spice-laden barrel. They're out to corner the market, crush the smugglers, and turn nutmeg into a Dutch monopoly. You're back aboard the VOC ship, now docked at a larger island nearby. The officers argue over maps while sipping warm beer and fanning themselves with old treaties. One says the English have built another fort. Another mutters about sending a message. You lean back, nibbling dried mango, and try not to look too interested. And this is where it gets weird. Nutmeg fever doesn't just drive trade. It drives war. Full-blown, cross-hemisphere, salt-stained, bureaucratically justified conflict. The Dutch send ships. The English send more ships. Everyone waves papers and claims they were here first. Sometimes the spice harvest is burned by one side just to keep it from the other. Nutmeg becomes both the prize and the weapon. And the locals? They're caught in the middle, navigating a foreign economic storm with admirable grace, occasional sabotage, and a fair bit of eye-rolling. Back in New Amsterdam, news trickles in slowly, if at all. To the average fur trader, the idea that your muddy little town could one day be swapped for this spice-soaked paradise is laughable. You wouldn't trade a decent log cabin for a tree full of nutmeg, let alone an entire colony. But the higher-ups are beginning to think differently. Spice is power. Spice is prestige. And Manhattan? Well, it's mostly beavers and grumpy Swedes at this point. You pace the deck at dusk, watching the sun pour fire into the sea. Below, crates of nutmeg are carefully packed with damp moss and loaded into the hold like they're newborns. You pass one and inhale deeply. It smells warm, earthy, like Christmas morning mixed with sunburn. You get it now. Not just the price, but the pull. There's something about it, this little wrinkled seed, that feels important. You remember the trees on run, reaching upward like they know they've caused trouble. You remember the Dutch factor's words. That tree is worth more than your town. Maybe he's right. Maybe he's completely lost in the fever. But one thing's for sure, the world's about to change over this little spice. Empires will make deals. Colonies will be swapped. And somewhere years from now, someone will walk through Times Square, never guess it was traded for a grove of nutmeg. You look over the railing at the sea below, black and glittering like spilled ink. Somewhere beneath, currents swirl. Deals are forming, and history is already rearranging itself. You're no longer swaying on a ship or ankle-deep in New Amsterdam mud. Now, you're stepping into a room where the air smells like candle wax, ink, and possibly some very old pickled herring. The floorboards creak with consequence. Welcome to the nerve center of global trade, the offices of the Dutch East India Company, or, if you try to impress someone, the Verenigd Oost-Indisch Company. VOC, for short. Thankfully, this is not just a trading company. This is the first multinational corporation in history, and it behaves accordingly. It issues stock, holds shareholder meetings, and yes, it maintains its own private navy. You stare at the men seated around a wide, dark table, all of them in black coats with matching expressions of measured greed. They are merchants, yes, but also kingmakers. The ledgers here are thick. The pens scratch like they're carving destiny. And they are obsessed with two things, profit and exclusivity. For them, the Banda Islands are not just profitable, they are strategically irreplaceable. Why sell nutmeg when you can control it? Mainstream historical fact? The VOC was chartered in 1602 and given sweeping powers by the Dutch government. It could wage war, imprison people, negotiate treaties, and build colonies, all in the name of business. The idea of a private company doing this seems bonkers now. But in the 17th century, it was standard if you had the boats, the money, and enough wigs. Quirky tidbit? One VOC administrator was so focused on controlling the nutmeg trade that he ordered excess trees chopped down and burned in fire with satisfaction. You imagine him cackling as fragrant smoke filled the air, a Dutch Scrooge McDuck with a torch. Here's how it works. The VOC establishes outposts, called factories, staffed by merchants and soldiers. These aren't places where things are made, but where things are weighed, cataloged, signed for, and sometimes stolen. Goods come in nutmeg, cloves, pepper, silk, and they go out bound for Amsterdam, London, and beyond. You sip watery coffee. Yes, they drink it here. It's catching on. And watch a clerk carefully seal a wax stamp crate marked Banda. It's bound for a VOC warehouse in Batavia. Present-day Jakarta. There, it'll be resorted, repacked, and put on a bigger ship for the long, miserable voyage to Europe. Historians still argue whether the VOC's monopoly was a result of brilliant strategy or just good timing. There's no doubt the Dutch were shrewd, but they also benefited from being early adopters of ruthless capitalism. They weren't necessarily better sailors than the Portuguese or stronger fighters than the English, but they were relentless accountants. And in this era, a well-kept ledger can be deadlier than a sword. You're ushered into a side room where a map of the world sprawls across the wall. But it's not the world as it is. It's the world as the VOC wants it to be. Red pins mark colonies. Green ones mark spice sources. Black pins? Those are less promising outposts. Like New Amsterdam. You follow the gaze of merchant as it drifts toward the Atlantic. We should hold Manhattan, he murmurs. But for what? What does it do? He gestures toward the Banda Islands. This feeds Europe. It's not a secret that New Amsterdam is underperforming. The fur trade isn't what it used to be. The English are creeping in, building their own little settlements, and Peter Stuyvesant's wooden leg is reportedly wearing down from all the stomping. The VOC is starting to wonder if it might be better to cut their losses. You poke a crate of mace and imagine pitching it to a boardroom. So this one little tree kernel is worth more than Manhattan, and it smells like cookies. Someone would nod slowly, write cookie gold in their notebook, and approve a war. You drift through the warehouse, dodging spice barrels, ink-stained clerks, and a parrot someone definitely stole from a passing Portuguese ship. Outside, dockhand haul crates of nutmeg-down gangplanks. They work like ants, methodical and silent, each crate labeled, numbered, and bound for markets that have never even heard of run. And you realize this is a machine. Not just trade, but trade scaled up, industrialized, and disguised as diplomacy. The VOC has more ships than most navies. It has more cash than some monarchies. And it can, if it wants to, trade away a city like Manhattan with a single signature. But for now, it focuses on what matters. Spice. Back in the meeting room, someone produces a letter. News from Run. A scuffle with the English. Possibly more than a scuffle. There's talk of fortifying plantations, maybe dispatching more troops. They'll never give it up, someone sighs. The English are obsessed with having something, even if they don't know what to do with it. You glance out the window. A storm brews on the horizon. Thick clouds rolling over the water. Ships come and go. Crates are loaded and unloaded. Somewhere, in a jungle you've barely left, nutmeg trees sway in the wind, entirely unaware of the contracts, maps, and meetings happening because of them. You feel like a ghost drifting through a clockwork empire. Every cog moving precisely, every crate stacked just so. But beneath it all is a fever, that burning need to own, to corner, to control. And soon, it will push someone to offer a trade. Something small for something smaller, depending on who's asking. You return to New Amsterdam under a sky that looks like it's thinking about rain, but hasn't quite committed. The town hasn't changed much. Still muddy, still noisy, still very proud of its underwhelming windmill. But something feels different. The English are here now, and they're, well, not exactly welcome, but tolerated, in that very specific way that involves awkward silences, side-eye glances, and passive-aggressive fence building. You're walking along a rutted street when you spot a fresh plank nailed to the side of a house. Private property. Do not remove geese. You nod in appreciation. At least the locals still have a sense of priorities. Mainstream historical fact? By the mid-1600s, the English had established colonies up and down the Atlantic coast. To the north was New England. To the south, Virginia. New Amsterdam was the Dutch meat in an English colonial sandwich. And nobody likes feeling like meat. But the English settlers kept coming, crossing borders, buying up land, marrying Dutch widows, and generally blurring the lines. The colony's leadership, especially good O.L. Stuyvesant, viewed these newcomers with barely concealed suspicion. They spoke funny. They insisted on tea breaks. And most annoyingly, they kept asking why everything was in metric. Quirky tidbit? One early land dispute involved an Englishman building a fence 3 feet over the agreed boundary. The Dutch neighbor responded by planting his outhouse exactly at the new edge. It's unclear who won, but historians agree that neither party was especially subtle. And you're caught in the middle. Your job is expanded to include ferrying passive-aggressive letters between governors. You've learned that English handwriting is loopier, but Dutch punctuation is fiercer. One letter from the Dutch council ended with 5 exclamation marks and a drawing of a very stern windmill. As you trudge from house to house delivering official frowns, you can't help but notice how much the colony is shifting. Shops now carry both Dutch stroopwafels and English marmalade. Children yell at each other in a hodgepodge of languages. And while the official flag still flies orange, white, blue, there's a faint smell of English breakfast brewing. Historians still argue whether the growing English presence was tolerated out of pragmatism or sheer exhaustion. Some say the Dutch knew they were outnumbered and hoped good manners might win the day. Others argue that New Amsterdam was simply too chaotic to notice who was who half the time. You visit the market, where vendors shout over each other about salted herring, apples, and, for some reason, a suspiciously shiny goat. You buy a warm roll from a baker who winks and calls you governor in a Cockney accent, so thick you momentarily question geography. He tells you the English settlers are lobbying to name a street King's Road. The Dutch are lobbying harder to name it absolutely not King's Road. And somewhere beneath all this friendly bickering is a deepening tension. Peter Stuyvesant, who you spot one afternoon yelling at a tree, sends word to Amsterdam. He wants reinforcements. He wants clarification. Mostly, he wants someone to take this English problem seriously before it turns into a crisis. The VOC replies with creative paperwork and a polite reminder that nutmeg is still more important than whatever's happening in the Hudson. You find yourself writing letters late into the night, your candle flickering, your handwriting growing sloppier by the hour. Reports from the Banda Islands mention skirmishes. Rumors say the English have fortified Apache Run. Meanwhile, in New Amsterdam, a group of settlers wants to start an English-language newspaper. The Dutch governor suggests starting a bonfire instead. Still, the city limps forward. New buildings rise, more ships arrive, and the population creeps up. It's not glamorous, but it's becoming something. You stand at the waterfront and imagine it as a real port city, cleaner, taller, more organized, maybe even worth holding on to. And that's when a ship from London docks, carrying news that will change everything. A war is brewing. Official, Crown-approved Sabres and Wigs war. The Anglo-Dutch rivalry has finally spilled over from trade routes and spice thefts into open conflict. Treaties are breaking like dry twigs. Fleets are mobilizing. Colonies are now pawns. You walk through the town the next morning with this new knowledge bouncing around your head. The streets feel different, sharper, like the wind has picked up and everyone's pretending not to notice. You pass the fort. The cannon looks optimistic at best. Some English settlers are helping repair the palisade, whistling while they work. You can't tell if that's friendly cooperation or a very polite invasion. A council meeting is called. You sneak in under the pretense of delivering ink. The room buzzes. Stuyvesant wants to fight. Others want to negotiate. One merchant argues that war is bad for business, especially when you just got in a shipment of French wine, and no one wants to drink it under cannon fire. The tension between Dutch and English settlers is reaching a quiet boil. Everyone smiles, but their hands are on the hilt of legal deeds and kitchen knives. You feel in the air, the colony is on edge. And yet, outside the stockade walls, the beavers are still swimming. The forest still hums. The harbor still smells like seaweed and fish guts. Manhattan doesn't know it yet, but it's on the table. In a room you can't see, someone is already holding a pen above a treaty. You glance toward the east. Somewhere across the sea, nutmeg trees sway in a breeze, blissfully unaware that their spice-fueled fame is about to purchase this entire muddy outpost. For now, though, you've got to deliver another stack of letters and figure out why someone painted "Long Live the King" on the side of the windmill, then crossed out "King" and wrote "maybe." Today's task sounds simple enough. Go to the warehouse and help weigh sacks of beaver pelts against theoretical sacks of nutmeg. You know, just a typical Tuesday in colonial Manhattan. You step through the crooked door of the VOC trading house, where dust floats lazily in the shafts of light. Everything smells vaguely of wet fur and anxiety. A bored clerk looks up from a ledger and gestures toward a set of crates marked speculative comparison. You peer into one, half expecting it to be full of pure gold. Nope, just more nutmeg. So here you are, asked to contemplate one of the strangest mental equations in world history. What's more valuable, an island full of fur-bearing animals and cranky settlers, or a tree that grows spicy rocks in a tropical oven? Mainstream historical fact? In 1667, during negotiations and the Second Anglo-Dutch War, the Dutch and the English made a trade. The Dutch would formally cede Manhattan, which the English had already taken by force. In exchange for run, the teeny-tiny nutmeg island the Dutch had just captured. This deal became part of the Treaty of Breda, and nobody at the time thought it was particularly weird. Well, somebody probably thought it was weird, but they didn't have a newsletter. Historians still argue whether it was a fair trade. Some say the Dutch made a brilliant move, securing monopoly control over nutmeg and other spices for the next generation. Others point out that run's value declined sharply in the decades that followed, while Manhattan grew into, well, Manhattan. Whoops. You squat beside a fur bale and run your fingers through the pelts. They're soft, dense, valuable. Beavers may not be glamorous, but they built New Amsterdam, literally and economically. Beaver hats are still the fashion rage in Europe. Every merchant here has staked their fortunes on tails and top hats. Then you turn to the nutmeg. It's light, glossy, fragrant, also valuable, maybe more so. The question is how much more? That's what the treaty negotiators try to decide, with ink-stained hands and slightly too much wine. Quirky tidbit? There's a persistent legend that, when the Dutch delegates were presented with the trade, Manhattan for run, they shrugged and said, "Yes, that seems balanced." This may or may not be true. What's certain is that neither side predicted Manhattan would one day be filled with flashing billboards and overpriced bagels. You're not a diplomat. You're a sweaty colonial assistant with too many tasks and not enough shoes. But today, you're deep in the math of empire. Pelt counts, spice weight, shipping costs, projected returns. Your chalkboard looks like it's solving for X in is this island worth that one? Let's break it down. Manhattan, decent-sized island, strategic harbor, growing population, fur trade, already established, annoying neighbors, run minuscule, nearly impossible to defend, but home to the most coveted spice trees in the known world. From a strictly short-term economic perspective, run wins. Nutmeg sells for 10 times the price of beaver fur. Manhattan is a long game, a slow simmer, a muddy gamble. The Dutch want now profits. The English want future footholds. You hear murmurs outside. News is spreading. Not everyone is thrilled. The Dutch settlers in Manhattan feel abandoned. They're trading us for what? A seed? Someone hisses. One woman shakes a spoon angrily at a passing soldier. Tell Amsterdam I got tulips they can trade too. Inside the warehouse, someone sets up a mock exchange exhibit. One crate of nutmeg, one bale of fur. People file by and stare at them like they're priceless artifacts or contestants in a very boring beauty pageant. The Dutch officials seem calm, smug, even. We've secured the Indies, they say, as though that makes up for losing their American outpost. You imagine them back in Amsterdam, standing in front of a fireplace, toasted with cinnamon wine while chuckling about that soggy little island across the sea. Meanwhile, the English are having a field day. Oh, yes, they mutter, "Thank you for your generous gift. We shall treasure this random chunk of wilderness, and possibly build the biggest city in the world on it." You can feel history shifting under your feet. It creaks like the floorboards in the tavern back on Pearl Street. The crates you stack today will soon be footnotes in international law. Manhattan is being handed off not in a dramatic battle, but in a quiet, paperwork-laden agreement. You pause beside the first stack, brush your hands together, and sigh. It's hard to believe your little muddy colony is now part of England. Harder still to imagine that the Dutch actually think they got the better end of this deal. Still, there's something poetic about it. One island of lush tropical trees traded for another of gray pine and half-finished fences. Two different dreams of empire. Two different bets on the future. As you leave the warehouse, you see a sign someone's tacked to the door. Now under new management, again, below it in faint ink, but still no decent beer. The sky darkens. A ship waits in the harbor, and somewhere in a tropical grove thousands of miles away, the nutmeg trees sway gently, unaware that they've just been traded for a city that doesn't yet know how big it's going to become. You wake before dawn to the sound of whispered arguments and the unmistakable creak of a boat being loaded in secret. Welcome to the quieter side of the spice trade, the one that doesn't go through ledgers, that doesn't get stamped and wax sealed by the VOC, and definitely doesn't end up on any official Dutch shipping report. Today, you're entering the world of smugglers. You follow the smell of salt and clove down to a side dock, tucked between two sagging warehouses. A man in a sweat-drenched shirt waves you over, nodding without speaking. He's got a boat, two barrels marked dried fish that very obviously don't smell like fish, and a very nervous goat chewing at some rope. You climb in. The sun rises slowly over the harbor as your boat glides past sleepy guards and already bored fishermen. You've entered the underbelly of the spice world, where nutmeg changes hands in shadows, and everyone has a story about how they got it. Most of the stories are lies. Mainstream historical fact? Despite the VOC's brutal efforts to monopolize nutmeg, smuggling was constant. English, Portuguese, Arab, Indian, and Chinese traders all found ways to get their hands on the spice, through bribery, hidden compartments, or sometimes just hiding nutmeg seeds in their shoes and hoping no one checked too closely. Quirky tidbit: one English sailor is rumored to have sewn nutmeg into the lining of his dog's coat. The dog made it through customs. The sailor, unfortunately, sneezed mid-lie and was promptly thrown overboard. The dog became a local legend. Your boat docks on a small reef, where another ship waits, English, by the look of it. You watch as the barrels are quietly exchanged. Coins pass in gloved hands. No words, just a look, a nod, and the kind of eye contact that says, "This didn't happen, and I've never seen you before in my life." Historians still argue whether the volume of smuggled nutmeg ever came close to VOC's official exports, but they agree it was enough to make Dutch officials sweat, and not just from the heat. Smuggling didn't just steal profit. It weakened the illusion of total control, the idea that the Dutch had tamed this unruly, fragrant empire. Back on the island, VOC soldiers patrol the nutmeg groves like anxious gardeners with bayonets. They count the trees. They count the sacks. They definitely count the workers. Anything that doesn't add up is assumed to be theft. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it's just bad math. You slip into a grove as the sun reaches its peak. The nutmeg trees shimmer. Their fruit golden and mysterious. You pick one, split it gently, and study the red lace around the seed. That's mace, the bonus prize of spice. It's also valuable, also guarded, also smuggled. A local farmer waves you over, then carefully pulls a string from beneath a rock. A burlap sack emerges. Inside, dried nutmeg seeds, packed tight with dry leaves. He says something in a whisper. You don't understand the words, but the meaning is clear. These are for trade, just not their trade. You nod, and he disappears into the trees. Later, over lukewarm palm wine, you learn the routes. Nutmeg hidden in baskets of yams. Seeds sewn into collars. English boats disguised as fishing vessels. Even some VOC captains get in on it, sneaking a few extra sacks onto their ships and selling them privately in ports far from Dutch eyes. The company pretends not to notice, unless it has to notice. When a smuggler is caught, the punishment is swift and theatrical. A hanging, a public beating, a confiscation of everything down to the man's shoelaces. But for every one they catch, 5 slip through. You hear whispers about a man called Mace Beard. He's said to braid nutmeg-scented oil into his beard so he can track spice quality by sniff. Another story tells of a woman who cooked entire batches of bread with crushed nutmeg just to transport it without detection. The guards got hungry and ate the evidence. It's ridiculous. It's real. It's the other half of the empire, the one that doesn't make the reports. You spend a few days shadowing a smuggler, Johann, though you doubt that's his real name. He's friendly enough, though he never tells the same story twice. One day, he was a Portuguese noble. The next, a Jesuit spy. All you know for sure is that he sweats constantly and knows more secret trails than any map. He shows you a hiding spot beneath an old hollow tree. Best place for spice, he says. Even the ants are too scared to steal from here. You wonder if the ants have a syndicate. Then, just as suddenly, he's gone. Off to meet a buyer. Off to vanish into the sea breeze. And you're left standing in a clearing, nutmeg trees swaying above you, wondering how much of the world's wealth has moved to places like this. Quiet, illicit, unsung. You return to the VOC outpost a little dustier, a little wiser, and probably on at least 3 watch lists. The guards don't look at you. You don't look at them. Back in your quarters, you sit down to write in your journal. Today, you write, I watched the goat become a spice mule. And somehow, that made perfect sense. Outside, a shipment of officially sanctioned nutmeg is being loaded onto a Dutch frigate. But somewhere in the shadows, 5 more are already on their way. Hidden, bartered, whispered across waves. The spice must flow. You don't hear the cannon fire, at first. You feel it, a low, rolling thud beneath your feet, like someone dropped a very large book on the world's oldest floorboard. Then another, and another. You step outside and see a thin smear of smoke rising over the water. A sail flaps in the wind, blackened, tattered. Somewhere out there, just beyond the curve of the bay, 2 ships are going at it over something that probably started as an invoice. This is war by charter. You're still on run, or close enough to feel like a mosquito's primary target. But now, everything is just a little sharper. The breezes aren't gentle anymore. They carry tension. The groves feel less like spice gardens and more like battlegrounds waiting for boots. The VOC fort is on high alert, and the men you used to see casually lounging in hammocks are now adjusting powder flasks and muttering in low, annoyed Dutch. Mainstream historical fact? The Dutch East India Company and the English East India Company were more than just rivals. They were militarized trading giants with armies, navies, and fully sanctioned permission to fight wars as long as they made money doing it. These weren't skirmishes between kings. These were battles waged by merchants. And they didn't need royal declarations, just a balance sheet. You moved through the fort, ducking under ropes, stepping over crates, and politely avoiding the sight of a rather confused chicken wandering near the armory. Officers bark orders in a kind of controlled panic. There's word of an English ship approaching run again. This time not for trade, but for trouble. The fort's walls are high but crumbling. You spot patches where cannonballs have already kissed a stone. One soldier grumbles that they're using nutmeg sacks to plug gaps. Another mutters, at least it smells better than gunpowder. Quirky tidbit? In one lesser-known skirmish, a VOC cannon misfired so badly it launched a barrel of mace into a coconut tree. The coconut fell, hit a passing officer on the head, and knocked him unconscious. For weeks, the troops called him Captain Coconut. He didn't find it funny. You get drafted, not into the fighting, thankfully, but into logistics. You spend the morning counting biscuits and the afternoon redistributing leads shot into sacks labeled dried figs. You're not sure who's being fooled, but the man labeling the crates swears by it. It worked last time, he says, chewing on actual figs. Sort of. Historians still argue whether the VOC's war efforts in the Indies were efficient or simply relentless. There were certainly moments of brilliance, well-executed sieges, clever blockades. But there were also years of stalemates, bungled attacks, and occasional tropical diseases that made entire battalions too tired to care. You sit beside the walls at dusk, watching the sea. The English haven't landed yet, but they're close. You can feel them out there, waiting, planning, probably complaining about Dutch food. Inside the officers' quarters, a map is spread across a table. Ink circles show English positions. Little notes scribbled in the margins say things like possible smugglers here and who trained the goat. Everyone is tense, but the tone stays businesslike. War, to these men, is just aggressive accounting. The VOC commander calls it market enforcement. You call it possibly getting blown up over seasoning. And yet, the stakes are clear. Whoever controls Run doesn't just control the island. They control the entire global supply of nutmeg. That kind of monopoly isn't just profitable. It's legendary. You're handed a letter to copy. It's a formal complaint from the VOC to the English company. It accuses them of illegal anchoring, unauthorized negotiations with local chiefs, and the deliberate display of flags in a manner most provoking. You raise an eyebrow. Flags? Apparently. The English like to plant their flag in places they don't own yet, just to see if anyone argues. The Dutch have had enough. This letter, while formally written, practically hisses between the lines. You finish transcribing and send it off with a runner. Then you're back on biscuit duty. One sack seems to be moving on its own. You open it and find the goat again. You sigh. As night falls, a fire is lit near the fort's edge. Soldiers gather. One begins humming a tune. Another joins in. Soon, half the unit is singing a mildly off-key sea shanty about spice and heartbreak. You lean back against a barrel and let the sound wash over you. For a moment, it doesn't feel like war. It feels like exhaustion dressed in uniform. But just before sleep comes, a lookout shouts down from the tower. Lights on the water. The English are coming ashore. You're not sure what's about to happen. Maybe another polite standoff. Maybe muskets. Maybe someone's coconut will save the day again. All you know is that you're caught in the middle of a war being fought with company seals, ship manifests, and the occasional cannonball lobbed in frustration. And you think, if nutmeg is worth this much trouble, maybe it is magic. You don't sleep that night. Not because of cannon fire, though that does eventually come, but because the jungle won't stop talking. It chirps, it rustles, it hisses in the dark like a creature with too many legs and opinions. You lie in a hammock strung between two beams and a half-collapsed barack on the island of Run, and somewhere out there in the trees, English boots are crunching leaves. The siege has begun. Not the kind of siege you might expect. No towering walls. No trebuchets hurling flaming barrels. No grand speeches from atop horses. This one starts with footsteps. Silent boats landing under cloud cover. A handful of English East India Company soldiers, barely awake and probably mosquito-bitten, climbing the steep path up to the Dutch fort in the early hours of a very humid morning. You sit up as the alarm bell clangs, a flat, desperate sound, like someone dropped a pan down a staircase. VOC troops scramble to their feet. Some are still buttoning their coats. One has clearly slept in his boots and is now paying the blistery price. Mainstream historical fact? In 1616, and again in 1665, the tiny island of Run became a point of actual military conflict. English forces occupied it twice, attempting to claim a permanent foothold in the Banda Islands. In both cases, the Dutch responded with aggressive blockades and sieges, essentially trying to starve or overwhelm the English out of their prize. This isn't a massive battle. It's a test of patience and rations. The English quickly fortify a crude post on the far side of Run, near a cove the locals call Spicebone Bay. The Dutch dig trenches, not very deep ones, because the soil here seemed to be 40% tree roots and 60% stubborn. You are immediately put in charge of morale, which mostly means distributing slightly moldy biscuits and pretending they're exotic European cakes. This one, you say, handing a brick-like square to a soldier, was once eaten by the Duke of Orange's cousin. He nods with deep suspicion, then eats it anyway. Quirky tidbit? The English, short on food, resort to boiling nutmeg seeds in water to make soup. One officer claims it gave him visions of angels. Another vomited for 6 hours and threatened to defect to the Dutch. Culinary opinions are sharply divided. You watch the siege unfold in slow motion. Dutch troops occasionally fire muskets into the jungle, hitting nothing but leaves. English scouts creep close to the fort, leave notes written in bad Dutch, and vanish before they're caught. One note reads simply, "Still here. Regards." Another says, "Your goat defected. That was your goat. You try not to take it personally." Historians still argue whether the sieges of Run were militarily significant or just bizarre colonial slap fights. From your perspective, it's a bit of both. The Dutch blockade the island, cutting off English supplies. The English dig in and refuse to leave. And the nutmeg trees, they just keep growing, oblivious, innocent, unbothered by uniforms and national flags. You spend a lot of time under the trees now, carrying messages, sketching maps, and occasionally hiding behind spice crates during sudden outbursts of musket fire. The groves are calm, quiet, eerily so. You pick a nutmeg fruit, split open and sniff. It still smells like something worth fighting for, but the fighting is sad. There's no glory here, just heat, insects, dysentery. One day, you stumble across a temporary truce. Dutch and English soldiers sitting in the same clearing, trading tobacco and insults. One offers you a pipe. For peace, he says, and to forget the biscuits. You take it. They pass around mango. Nobody mentions who owns the island anymore. Later that night, back at the fort, the commander is furious when he hears about the mango summit. Fraternizing, he bellows. They are the enemy. The English want our nutmeg. You point out that, technically, they already have some. He glares at you until you remember a task you definitely need to be doing somewhere else. Days pass, then weeks. A storm hits, flattening part of the Dutch fence and soaking everything not already molded. Supplies run low. The English fire a single cannonball that misses the Dutch post entirely and crushes an unsuspecting pile of coconuts. You help rebuild the fence. You learn to patch sails. You learn which leaves not to touch. You also learn that someone is definitely hoarding rations. Probably Captain Coconut, who now insists he predicted the storm by listening to the mace. Eventually, the blockade works. The English, tired, hungry, and probably dreaming of cold roast beef, abandon their post on run. They pack their crates. They burn their fort. They roll quietly into the haze and disappear over the horizon. The Dutch erupt in a cheer that feels half-hearted and half-relieved. You slump beside the walls and stare at the spot where the English once sat passing mangoes. All of this, you think, for an island barely big enough to hold 2 forts and a disgruntled goat. Still, the victory means something. Run is back under VOC control. Nutmeg remains a Dutch monopoly, for now. You help hoist the flag again, this time carefully. Someone trips and almost sets it on fire. History, as always, teeters on the edge of farce. As you head back to your quarters, someone hands you a steaming bowl. Soup, they say. Nutmeg and coconut. You sip it slowly. It tastes like sweat, smoke, and the strangest kind of triumph. The ink isn't dry yet. You're in a narrow room somewhere in Breda, in the Low Countries. The air here is much colder than the tropical heat of Run or the muddy hustle of New Amsterdam. You can still feel the contrast in your bones, one half sunburned, the other clammy. Around you, men in powdered wigs murmur in at least 4 languages. Maps stretch across every available surface, like sleeping cats. On one, a circle is drawn in thick red around a small island labeled Run. On another, a triangle around Manhattan's. You are not in charge. You're not even really supposed to be here. You're an assistant to the assistant, one of the clerks. Sent to fetch candles and make sure nobody spills wine on the treaty. But you're close enough to see the quills scratch the parchment. You're watching the world change by committee. Mainstream historical fact: the Treaty of Breda, signed in 1667, ended the Second Anglo-Dutch War. Under its terms, England retained control of New Amsterdam, by then already rebranded New York, and the Dutch got full, undisputed rights to Run and the other Banda Islands, securing their precious spice monopoly. Everyone smiled politely. No one admitted they just traded one empire's future for another's fragrant sunset. Historians still argue whether it was intentional. Did the Dutch genuinely think Run was the better bargain? Or did they simply not understand what Manhattan would become? Or maybe they did and just didn't care. After all, nutmeg sold today. Beavers, not so much anymore. You walk the halls as the diplomats toast with weak sherry. You hear phrases like mutual benefit and commercial parity. And behind every word is the same idea. Let's stop bleeding men and money over islands and agree to disagree. For now. You pass a side table stacked with translations of the treaty. In Dutch, in English, in French, because someone insisted. You scan the lines, your eyes catching on the part that says, in the driest language imaginable, that His Majesty the King of England shall retain ye town of New Amsterdam. There's no drama. No mention of fur or nutmeg or goats or cannonballs. Just, it's yours now. Quirky tidbit. Some sources claim that when the Dutch delegates handed over the paperwork finalizing Manhattan's loss, one of them scribbled a tiny doodle of a windmill in the corner. Was it a signature flourish? A silent protest? A joke? No one knows. But the mark is real, still faintly visible on a surviving copy. You sit by the fire that evening with your worn-out journal, scribbling your own notes while diplomats snore upstairs. Today, you write, they traded trees for towers. Though they don't know it yet. You think of both islands, Run and Manhattan. You imagine a split screen, one side shimmering with tropical heat, nutmeg trees swaying quietly, VOC soldiers polishing rusty cannonballs. The other side muddy, loud, bristling with opportunity, its wooden shacks already giving way to brick and stubborn ambition. Outside, church bells ring. A group of negotiators wanders past, chuckling. New Amsterdam. One says, never quite fit us anyway. Let them rename it. Let them build their little city. They don't know. You do. You've walked both islands. You've squinted at spice trees and nearly frozen on foggy Hudson mornings. You've listened to Dutch governors shout about fences and watched English smugglers count barrels behind their backs. And now, you're watching the moment it all changes. You spot a diplomat adjusting his collar. In the mirror, he practices a smile. He's about to walk into a room and explain, very confidently, that this treaty represents equitable exchange and a new era of cooperation. He doesn't mention how many people died to secure a monopoly on what is essentially pie flavoring. There's something almost tragic about it, not the treaty itself. It probably saved lives and restored some fragile version of peace. But the quietness of it, the way history shifts not with shout, but with a pen. The English envoy offers you a coin for your trouble. You nod, take it, and step back into the corridor. Your boots click on the stone. You look up at the dull candlelight flickering against ancient wood beams and wonder. What if they hadn't traded? What if Manhattan stayed Dutch and Run went English? Would the world be different? Probably, but not in ways anyone could have predicted. You walk past a closed door and hear someone mutter. They'll be grateful. That island is nothing but fur and rain. You think of Wall Street, Broadway, Central Park, the future that already exists, invisibly pulsing in the bones of the earth. And then you think of Run, of the siege, of the cracked forts and endless spice groves, of men eating boiled nutmeg and claiming it gave them visions, of all the sweat and blood and bookkeeping that made this one-page swap possible. You exit the building as snow begins to fall, a quiet, apologetic flurry. The sky is gray. The air is still. The world has changed. No cannon fire. No fanfare. Just a handshake and a trade. You're back in Manhattan now. Not the future skyline or the neon din you once imagined, but the same muddy, clomping, drafty new Amsterdam turned New York. Only now, things have changed. The flag fluttering over the fort isn't orange, white, and blue anymore. It's a stiff red cross on a field of white, British now, and trying very hard to look proud despite having recently replaced a beaver on the colony's official seal with, well, just a crown. You squint up at the banner and sigh. You always like the beaver. The town is restless, not riotous, not angry, but unsettled in the way a house feels after new tenants arrive and start rearranging the furniture. Streets are being renamed. Dutch street signs are replaced with hand-painted English versions that mispronounce half the names. The Broad, flat road once used for sheep herding, the English now call it Broadway. You can't tell if that's brilliant or lazy. Mainstream historical fact? After the English officially took over in 1664, 3 years before the Treaty of Breda formalized it, they renamed New Amsterdam to New York in honor of the Duke of York, who'd been granted the territory by his brother, King Charles II. The name stuck, though most locals probably grumbled about it for a while. Quirky tidbit, the English also changed the name of Fort Amsterdam to Fort James. That lasted until someone else changed it again later. Colonial forts change names more often than taverns ran out of ale. You make your rounds through the town, delivering messages to new officials, many of whom still look mildly seasick and deeply suspicious of salted eel. The English officers speak with practiced politeness, but you notice how they glance at every Dutch building like it's about to spring a legal trap. They try to integrate into the community, attend services, pay taxes, say good morrow, but there's tension under every smile. The Dutch settlers, for their part, haven't fled. They're still here, still working, still trading fur and baking waffles. They're just less cheerful about it. You overhear one grumbling in the market. Let them take the name. They can't pronounce half of it anyway. You smile at that, then pause to watch a new cart roll by. It's an Englishman selling pies. Nutmeg apple, imported spice, he calls. You lean in, take a sniff. It's the real stuff. From Run. Probably. The irony tastes as sweet as the pastry. The taverns are louder now. More languages. More debates. Someone threw up a sign offering translations from Dutch to English, reasonable rates. Beneath it, someone scrawled, but unreasonable people. You notice how the colony is growing. New shacks along the northern edge. More ships at the harbor. More children running barefoot across cobblestones. The English have brought stricter bureaucracy, yes, but also more settlers, more supplies, more investment. And whether anyone likes it or not, New York is becoming something bigger than New Amsterdam ever was. Historians still argue whether the English takeover was a rupture or a continuation. In truth, it was both. The city didn't burn. The population didn't vanish. But the rhythm shifted. Trade reoriented toward London. Laws changed. So did priorities. You pass a man building a new storefront. He hammers nails into oak planks while his son reads from an English spelling primer. Nearby, a Dutch woman sells pickled onions from a cart and mutters about how things were simpler when Stuyvesant yelled at everyone. And yet, even with the name change, the new flag, and the revised property laws, the city still smells like fish and ambition. It still echoes with accents and arguments. Still as goats chewing on fence posts. You can take the Dutch out of the signage, but you can't take the colony out of the swamp. You sit on a barrel near the harbor, watching the tide roll in. Ships fly English flags now, but the people unloading crates speak French, Dutch, West African dialects, and sometimes all three at once. The global melting pot you once shrugged at is now bubbling in earnest. One crate nearby breaks open. Spices tumble across the dock. Nutmeg seeds, cinnamon sticks, and something unlabeled that smells like sandalwood and regret. You help scoop it up and wonder how many miles it's traveled, how many treaties, skirmishes, and diplomatic drafts it's crossed. You glance at the skyline, or what passes for one. The tallest structure is still a church spire, but buildings are creeping upward. Brick is starting to replace timber. Streets are being widened. The town is getting louder, dirtier, bolder. It's becoming a city. Someone next to you says, "Imagine what this place will look like in 100 years. You nod but say nothing, because you already know. You've seen the seed planted, the swap made, the flags changed, and now you're watching the future crawl out of the mud, dust itself off, and ask the directions to the next tavern. You toss a coin into the harbor for luck. Stand up and brush off your coat. You got letters to deliver, trade manifests to adjust, and somehow a goat to find. Again, the English call it New York now, but you still hear the echo, New Amsterdam. It's buried under bricks and bustle, but it's still there, a stubborn little heartbeat under a new name. You're standing in the middle of a warehouse again, surrounded by stacks of furs and the low rumble of someone failing to count in both Dutch and English. But you're not weighing pelts this time. No, you've been given a much harder task, figuring out the entire trade. Manhattan for Run was worth it. Good luck. This isn't just some idle barroom debate. People are whispering, muttering, speculating. A Dutch merchant argues over coffee that the spice monopoly they gained was pure genius. An English sailor points at Manhattan's ever-growing docks and snorts. They gave up the future for a fruit that smells like soup. You got your own suspicions. So you crack open a ledger, uncork some ink, and begin what historians and night shift clerks alike dread. Comparative accounting. Let's start with Run. Mainstream historical fact? After the Treaty of Breda in 1667 gave the Dutch uncontested control over Run, They finally got the monopoly they've been dreaming about for decades. For a time, the VOC controlled nearly all of the world's nutmeg and mace exports. Prices soared. European elites practically rolled themselves in spice. The company's profits climbed like an over-caffeinated parrot. But the VOC's monopoly was fragile. Seeds were eventually smuggled out by the French, the English, possibly even the Godigan, and planted successfully in places like Mauritius, the Caribbean, and even Grenada. The Dutch tried to torch unauthorized trees, but nature, as always, refused to fill out the proper paperwork. By the 18th century, nutmeg prices plummeted. What had once been worth a king's ransom was now just another seasoning, rattling around in household spice drawers. The VOC spice empire, once dazzling, slowly crumbled under the weight of its own spice-obsessed bureaucracy. Now look at Manhattan. Quirky tidbit: when the English took over Manhattan, it had a few thousand residents, mostly Dutch. Within 50 years, that number tripled. The port became a crucial hub for British trade in the Americas. The city began to attract merchants, artisans, smugglers, dreamers. People had no idea they were building a future global capital between fishing docks and taverns that still couldn't get the ale right. And while the English were busy shaping the political structure in New York, the Dutch quietly remained part of the city's economic DNA. Dutch customs, Dutch property laws, even the beloved stoop architecture, those traces never really went away. They just rebranded. Historians still argue which side got the better deal. In the short term, the Dutch. They secured spice profits and reinforced their control in the East Indies. In the long term, obviously the English, who turned Manhattan into the beating heart of modern finance, fashion, and philosophical confusion over what exactly counts as pizza. You lean back, rubbing your temples. It's a question of perspective. To the VOC, run was worth it. Tangible profit, strategic control, and fewer Englishmen trying to sell tea next to your mace barrels. But they couldn't see the centuries ahead, the waves of immigrants, the Revolutionary War, the skyscrapers, the jazz clubs, the stock exchanges. Manhattan was a seed too, just a different kind, one that wouldn't flower for generations. You walk out into the street and look around at the clatter and hum of colonial New York. It's not glamorous, but it's growing. You smell horses, bread, seaweed, and just a faint note of something imported. Spice, maybe. There's a new energy here. Buildings are taller. People walk faster. A young man runs past you shouting about a land grant. A woman behind him yells about overdue rents. This place is a mess, but it's alive in a way Run never really was. Still, the island of Run has something New York never will. Peace. It remains small, green, fragrant. A place where nutmeg trees still rustle in the breeze, and nobody's worried about real estate taxes. If you were offered both islands today, it might come down to mood. Manhattan for ambition, Run for silence. You pass a pub window, and hear two men arguing the trade again. Nutmeg, one growls. At the time, it made sense. Sure, the other replies, and at the time, leeches were medicine. You keep walking. At the edge of the harbor, you sit and let your thoughts drift like the tide. Was it a fair trade? No. Yes. Maybe. History has a strange sense of humor. One island built a spice empire that withered. The other built a city that swallowed the world. You pluck a nutmeg seed from your pocket and roll it in your palm. Still fragrant. Still precious in its own way. A reminder of a moment when the world turned on a tiny wrinkle of flavor. You drop the seed into water, watch the ripples stretch outward, and wonder how long the echo will last. You wake up to the smell of failure, damp wood, spoiled spice, and the faint bitterness of old contracts. Nutmeg, it seems, is no longer king. The once rigid spice monopoly, forged by Dutch ambition and sealed by treaties, is unraveling. You can feel it in the sluggish pace of the warehouse, in the silence where there used to be shouting over shipment weights and miscounted barrels. Something has shifted, and the nutmeg empire, grand, fragrant, obsessively organized, is starting to fall apart. Mainstream historical fact: by the early 1700s, the Dutch monopoly on nutmeg and other spices began to decline. Despite their best efforts, Nutmeg seedlings had made their way off-Run and the other Banda Islands. The French succeeded in cultivating them in Mauritius and Réunion. The British soon followed, planting groves in places like Grenada and Penang. The VOC tried to maintain its grip, burning trees, executing smugglers, even scouring plantations for unauthorized seedlings. But the flood had already begun. Spices were no longer exclusive. They were becoming common. Quirky tidbit? In 1770, French horticulturalist Pierre Poivre, yes, his name literally means Peter Pepper, famously smuggled nutmeg and clove plants out of the Indies. He packed them in soil-filled boxes and disguised them among more mundane cargo. It worked. He is now a culinary legend in both espionage and gardening circles. You sit at your old desk, ink-stained, termite-nibbled, and glance at the latest cargo manifests. Prices are falling. European markets are flooded with once exotic flavors. What used to cost a fortune now comes bundled with cinnamon and a discount gingerbread recipe. Nutmeg isn't worthless, but it's not power anymore. And without power, the VOC has a problem. You walk through the fort, less of a fortress these days, more like a very stern museum exhibit. The walls are crumbling, the cannons rusting, and the guard schedule now includes naps. The soldiers play cards with English merchants who arrived under neutral trade agreements. Everyone pretends not to notice. Historians still argue whether the VOC fell due to corruption, overextension, or simple market shifts. The truth, like most things, is probably all of the above. For decades, the company thrived by treating the world like an inventory list. But once that world started ignoring the price tags, the ledgers didn't add up anymore. You help sort a shipment of nutmeg today. Fewer crates than usual. The workers seem half awake. You overhear one mutter, "Maybe we should start planting coffee." Another replies, "Maybe we should start planting feet and running." You've never seen it this quiet. The grove paths are overgrown. No one counts the trees anymore. The scent still lingers in the air, warm and earthy, but now it clings like memory instead of promise. You pass a plantation house where the shutters hang loose, and a single crate of spice sits unopened on the porch. Once, that crate would have required an armed escort and 3 wax seals. Now it's just there. You sit beside it, legs dangling, and watch the sun dip below the trees. Back in Amsterdam, you hear the company stock is collapsing. Shareholders are furious. The government is getting involved. The VOC's one-slick machine is grinding to a halt under its own paperwork. By 1799, it will be dissolved completely, its holdings absorbed by the Dutch state, its fleet scattered, its offices shuttered. And Run, it returns to what it always was. A quiet, green island, outliving the empires that fought for it. The trees still fruit. The birds still chatter. And if you didn't know better, you'd think none of it ever happened. No sieges, no treaties, no whisper-thin sea that once launched ships. You visit the site of the Old English fort one last time. It's just moss and memories now. A single rusted nail lies buried in the dirt. You pick it up, roll it between your fingers, and imagine what it once held together. A door? A banner? A belief? Quirky debates still swirl through your thoughts. Was the fall of Nutmeg's empire inevitable? Or did greed blind its guardians of change? Perhaps it was hubris to think you could own flavor forever. You walk the edge of the grove, inhaling that familiar scent one last time. It's still wonderful, still warm, mysterious, comforting, but no longer exclusive, no longer dangerous. Just spice. You smile to yourself. Empires fall, fortunes shift, and even the most jealously guarded treasures become part of everyday life. What was once priceless is now a pinch added to tea. And maybe that's not a loss. Maybe that's just how stories settle. You're back in Manhattan now, again, though maybe it's time to stop calling it that muddy outpost you once trudged through, because now it's changing right before your eyes. You walk down what used to be a half-washed trail flanked by goats and disgruntled settlers, and it's paved. Not fully, not evenly, but paved. People no longer slosh across it so much as stride. Horses clatter. Carriages pass. Buildings rise like mushrooms after spring rain. brick instead of timber, 2 stories instead of 1, some even with real glass and windows. New York is growing up. Mainstream historical fact? By the mid-1700s, New York City, formerly Dutch New Amsterdam, had become one of the most important ports in the British colonies. Its harbor bustled with ships from Europe, the Caribbean, and Africa. It was a commercial powerhouse, importing goods, exporting raw materials, and serving as a launch pad for the early financial institutions that would define the young republic a few decades later. You make your way to harbor, and where once there were sacks of beaver pelt stacked crookedly in the sun, now there are merchant stalls, currency exchanges, and men in powder wigs shouting about debt securities. It's still messy, still noisy, still stubborn, but it's no longer provincial. It's strategic. The old Dutch-style homes haven't vanished entirely, but they're squeezed now between English brick row houses and Georgian manors. Languages still mix. Dutch hasn't disappeared, but now you also hear Scottish brogues, Irish chatter, German merchants negotiating in Low Saxon. The city is, somehow, all of them at once. You duck into a bakery where someone sells cinnamon rolls dusted with, of course, nutmeg. Imported now not just from Run, but from Grenada and Mauritius and other islands you once knew only by VOC shipping codes. The spice isn't rare anymore, but it still tastes like something old, something earned. Quirky tidbit? In the 18th century, nutmeg became so common in New York kitchens that it was sold from wheelbarrows in street markets. One vendor was said to wear a sign reading, "Spice for all, even the unimaginative." A bold claim for a man hawking flavored bark. You buy a bun, stroll along the edge of the market, and marvel at how far this place has come since you first arrived with wet boots and a list of pelt weights. There's no sign of the old Dutch fort anymore. It's been refitted, renamed, repurposed into something less military and more administrative. A polite way of saying we're selling coffee now. Historians still argue whether New York's rise was inevitable due to geography or made possible by that strange Dutch to English swap. You think it was both. The harbor was always destined for greatness, but the paperwork just gave it permission. You pass Wall Street. Yes, that Wall Street, which now functions less as a livestock barrier and more as a financial district. It still smells faintly of manure, though. Some things cling to legacy. Bankers argue on the steps of taverns. Sailors unload barrels with astonishing efficiency. An artist paints the skyline, which now includes at least 3 buildings tall enough to inspire mild vertigo. The city stretches, yawns, and shakes the dust of its colonial past. But it remembers. That's the thing. You walk past a church and see an old woman whispering in Dutch. A boy eats a stroopwafel on the stoop. A street sign still reads Brooklyn, though someone scratched in Brooklyn underneath. The Dutch haven't vanished. They've sunk into the city's roots. You find yourself standing in front of a mapmaker's shop. In the window, a new rendering of New York. Below it, the words, formerly New Amsterdam. You smile. It's not a correction, it's a confession. The city is both. Always has been. You wander to the edge of the island and look out over the harbor. Ships rise and fall on the tide. Smoke curls from chimneys. Somewhere, someone is inventing a new kind of sandwich. You feel it. The hum, the hunger, the humbling chaos of a place that never stops changing. Back then, you stood on this same shoreline, wondering why anyone would trade this for a nutmeg grove. Now, you wonder the people who made the deal could have ever imagined this view. Could they have imagined a city with millions? With towers taller than sails, electricity running like lightning through walls, music that spills from windows at midnight, a park in the middle where kids feed pigeons while skyscrapers watch from above? Probably not. But you do, because you've seen both worlds. The sleepy spice groves and the seething streets. And now, with each step, you walk through a city that once was traded, casually, diplomatically, as though it were just another line item. Now it lives. You pass a newsboy shouting about shipping rates. A woman haggles over oranges. A dog runs off with someone's boot. And somewhere inside you, a voice whispers, Run may have been the Empire's prize. But this was the real treasure. You return one last time to the Bond de Sea, not as a clerk, not as a spice carrier or reluctant messenger, but as a quiet observer retracing old steps. Run greets you like an old friend who's aged gracefully while you were off chasing bigger dreams. The island hasn't changed much. It still hums with birdsong and the rustle of nutmeg trees. The ocean still laps at its dark, volcanic shore, gentle but constant, like a breath that never stops. No empires loom here anymore. No cannons watch the cove. Just green hills. Just spice trees. You walk the old paths, worn smoother now by time and weather. The forts are gone or collapsed into vine-covered ruins. A few foundation stones remain, mossy, crumbling, half swallowed by the jungle. If you didn't know what happened here, you might think this island had always been peaceful. But you do remember. You run a hand along a tree trunk. The bark cracked like old parchment. This one might be a descendant of the trees you once helped catalog, or maybe it's the very same one. Still rooted, still offering fruit like nothing ever happened. It drops a nutmeg just beside your boot. You smile. Mainstream historical fact? Today, the Banda Islands are part of Indonesia, and Run is just one of many small islands in a sprawling, diverse archipelago. Nutmeg is still harvested here, mostly by small-scale farmers. The spice is no longer precious. It's available in grocery stores worldwide. But the island remains a symbol of trade, of obsession, of how far people will go for flavor and fortune. The locals call you over to share tea. You sit on a woven mat, sipping slowly, listening to their stories, some old, some new, all shared under the dappled shade of nutmeg branches. There's laughter, soft talk, the occasional squabble over who makes a better fish stew. Life here is rhythm again, and a kind of peace the empires never managed to leave behind. Quirky tidbit, one of the island's modern claims to fame is a local legend that nutmeg oil can soothe heartbreak if dabbed behind both ears and consumed with strong tea. No one agrees whether it works, but everyone swears it helped their cousin. You walk the shoreline after the meal, watching the tide pull threads of foam across the rocks. The world feels quiet, spacious, a kind of quiet few people in cities remember. No shouting merchants, no clatter of hooves, just water, wind, and the gentle clink of shells. Historians still argue whether Run should be remembered as a turning point in colonial trade or a footnote in the story of globalization. But to you, standing barefoot on the edge of its volcanic sand, it feels more like a mirror. It reflects what people value, what they chase, what they're willing to give away. You take a deep breath. You think of Manhattan, now a world away, loud, sprawling, brilliant. You picture its towers scraping clouds, its subways humming below the streets, its endless pulse of energy and motion. And you realize both islands have stories worth telling. Run is the echo. New York is the shout. One offered spice. The other offered possibility. And in some quiet, stubborn corner of history, someone with a quill and a map decided they could be traded. Seed for soil, scent for skyline. You crouch by the sand and draw a simple shape. One island, then the other. A line between them. Then you let the tide wash it away. The sun sinks toward the horizon, casting Run in a warm golden light. You walk back to the grove, the leaves whispering overhead. You pause at the base of a nutmeg tree, run your fingers through the moss, and leave one small, silent thank you in the soil. For everything, for what was gained, for what was lost. And now, as the sun dips low and the shadows lengthen across this quiet little island, you find yourself slowing too, letting go of the stories, the comparisons, the numbers and flags and timelines. The world you just walked through, spice and sprawling, muddy and magnificent, begins to soften around the edges. The tree branches sway gently overhead, rustling like an old lullaby. The scent of nutmeg still lingers faintly in the air, warm, comforting, just earthy enough to feel real. That same scent that once launched ships and inked treaties now simply floats. No war in it, no urgency, just a scent in the air. Let your shoulders relax now. Let the images fade, the muddy boots, the crumbling forts, the arguments over fences, the ledgers packed with dreams. Let them settle like dust at the bottom of the sea. You follow them far enough for tonight. Inhale slowly, exhale slower. You've stood on Run. You wandered New Amsterdam. You watched an empire trade flavor for future. And now your part is done. You're not a smuggler or a diplomat or a clerk anymore. Just a quiet presence on the wind, drifting away with the tide. Let the history recede like the ocean at dusk. Still there, still true, but no longer asking anything of you. Just waves now. Just sleep,